Good evening. This is Sue Frank. I'm curator at the Phillips Collection, and I'm also curator of the Picasso painting, The Blue Period. It is a show that I co-organized with my co-curator colleague, Kenneth Brummel from the Art Gallery of Ontario. And we have the exceptional support of the Musée National Picasso Paris. And I am happy to have all of you here this evening. I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to try to get through quickly, so we have time for questions at the end. And for anyone who has a question that they want to pose, and we can answer, at the end of my program, please put your questions in the Q&A that's in the along the line here. So let me just start, because the title of our program tonight is actually Picasso's Blue Period Women, Prostitutes, Prisoners, Mothers, and Beggars. And so that really kind of constitutes our program. And before I move on to the first slide, let me just say that it's really foundational about the three paintings that are really the key parts of this exhibition and how it was organized. So I will be very much speaking about the Phillips Collection's painting, The Blue Room, about the Art Gallery of Ontario's two Blue Period works, The Crouching Beggar Woman and The Soup. And so just to give a précis to you to understand how the Blue Period is a shift from Picasso's previous work in that same year, 1901, is when the Blue Period actually emerges. And in the first half of that year, Picasso is exploring a style and women who are, as you see, this woman on the left with the plumed hat from the McNay Art Museum. She is wearing this big hat, a necklace at her neck that is highly jeweled and very distinctive, that signifies that she is a very expensive prostitute known as a cocotte. And she's looking directly out at us. Very flashy brushwork, and then this beautiful delineation of her face. And the other two works that you see are both Paris pictures from early 1901. Picasso in Montmartre. It's this moment where he's immersed in the nightlife of Montmartre. A 19-year-old young man in Paris for the second time in 1901, had been there just a few months earlier in the fall of 1900. And what an opportunity for him to go and kind of explore, all of that Paris nightlife can offer him. He's living at the foot of Montmartre Hill, right in the entertainment district, just a few blocks away from the Moulin Rouge. And on the right, you see this dancer from Spanish dancers, the title that she's been given. And she too looks at it but her face is like a mask, but it's this very vibrant color and this broken brushwork that you see. And in the center of this picture that is at the Krieger Museum in Washington, at the cafe, it shows you again, two high, prostitutes that are seated at a cafe in Montmartre. You see one cropped on the left, talking to her companion at the table. And then this waiter that's coming, to deliver them something in this very handsome looking bowl, it's been decapitated. We don't see his head. These very kind of interesting compositional devices that Picasso is exploring. And it too, this painting from the Krieger at the cafe has this brilliant palette of bright reds, yellows, greens, brilliant whites. And during this moment in the first middle of the year of 1901, when he's preparing for this exhibition at the Galerie Vollard, his first Paris exhibition, the paintings of women that he creates during this 6-week period of before the exhibition at Villar Gallery opens on June 25th. He is looking at women from the brothel, these two women on the right, the nude with red stockings and the woman in blue stockings, you know, displaying their bodies to us, showing themselves as would be the case within the brothel itself. The two pictures on the left, on the far left, this woman, Jean, atop a bed, her naked body there, very kind of, the flesh of her body, very much something that Picasso has spent time kind of making look sumptuous. And we are at the foot of the bed, gazing up at her. It's very much a sense of voyeurism that Picasso is exploring here. A woman making herself available to us. And the same with the nude with cats, this woman, the second from the left. A small picture, but it carries such a graphic punch. It's very gritty picture with the cats that tell us that this is a prostitute. Cats being very much associated at the end of the 19th century in French painting with feral activity and thus associated with prostitution. And this woman, much less kind of sumptuous brushwork, the harder, grittier depiction of her. But yet, again, it's this idea of the male gaze that Picasso is exploring and experimenting with. And the different styles of brushwork and approach to his work is very much in evidence here. And the blue period, it begins to emerge at the end of the summer. And one of the moments that opens the door to this is Picasso's reflection on the suicide of his Barcelona friend, Carlos Casagamus, who had committed suicide in Paris in February of 1901, just a few months earlier. The photograph you see in the top left, this shows Picasso on the far left, friend in Barcelona, another artist, Angel de Soto, in the center, and Casagamus is on the right. He's the tallest of the three. And they're on the rooftop terrace of the apartment building where Picasso's family was living. And this was taken about 1900 when Picasso and Casagamus were such good friends, and they had spent the fall of 1900 in Paris together and explored the Paris nightlife together. They had spent time in the brothels. They had had two models living with them who they had intimate and friendly relationships with. It was a high time for these two young men. Casagamus, a year older than Picasso. And so Picasso was not in Paris when Casagamus committed suicide from an unrequited love affair with one of these models. And the reflection about Casagamus was something that settled in on Picasso's personal thoughts at the end of the summer, after that exhibition at Villar had closed and those kind of heady days of preparation for that exhibition had concluded. And those works from the exhibition that had not sold were returned to him in his studio. And so the two paintings that you see on the left, Casagamus in his coffin and the dead Casagamus, in which you see the wound in his right temple, were from the late summer, early autumn. And this entire period in the beginning and the end of the summer and into the autumn is a moment where Picasso is thinking about himself as an artist, thinking about his friend who was 20 years old when he committed suicide. And this painting in this large vertical painting that you see, Evocation, the Burial of Casagamus, is a work that Picasso did that fall, which kind of summarized many of his thoughts about Casagamus, but in this very a painting that evokes a religious altarpiece, but in a very blasphemous fashion. A work that was inspired by a large altarpiece that Picasso knew in Toledo in Spain, called The Burial of Count Orgaz. And so at the bottom register, what you see is the corpse. It's surrounded by a group of mourners that include both men and women. And I draw your attention to the fact that these figures are, the women are all pulling cloaks close around them, their hands folded in their laps. They have these enclosed figures hugging themselves, these robes that have these very heavy, large shadows of folds that do make one think of the manner in which El Greco did depict fabric in his own pictures. And in the middle register, you see this figure of a mother with an infant pulled tight to her, and she too wears this robe, and then these two toddlers. And then you see these prostitutes on either side of the mother figure. And this figure of Casagamus is on the white horse with his arms spread out in a crucifixion pose, being kissed by a prostitute as he ascends into some heaven that's certainly not anything like a Christian heaven. But this is Picasso's manner of trying to digest, incorporate, dispel some of the heavy thoughts that he had about his friend's untimely death. And I just point out that the two pictures on the left, the dead Casagamus and the Casagamus in his coffin, were pictures that Picasso kept private, were never revealed to anyone for 60 years, whereas the evocation was a work that he did exhibit. And I bring out on the right this work, Woman in a Bathrobe, one of the few nudes that Picasso was doing at this period in 1901. And she introduces this idea of the melancholy woman. And I mention her because her pose, this bending pose, and the hands crossed over her genital area, go back again, that she mimics the same pose as these mourning figures. This is one of the things that Picasso does. He takes a pose and he repurposes it in a new way. But here he's taking mourning figures and he's applying it to figures of young women, and here a nude. And so this becomes a manner in which we have come to understand the Blue Room in a little larger context. Our studies on this painting have been foundational to a kind of new awareness of the manifest breadth of sources that Picasso was bringing together in this picture that we now understand from our conservation studies is a work that could not have been painted before the end of October 1901, perhaps in November 1901, because the portrait hidden beneath it was completely dry. And we have dated that portrait beneath the painting that you see to perhaps July of 1901. So what we now understand is that our painting at the Phillips, it evokes this idea of the melancholy woman. Scholars have written about this, and now we understand her as being a figure that is, more associated with work in the later part of the autumn of 1901, and that her bending pose also relates to those mourning figures. Picasso's source material for her is both Degas and the two works that you see on the left, lithograph that we have in the exhibition of the nude woman standing and drying herself, that Picasso may well have known, and certainly this pastel on monotype that you see, the crouching nude from behind, that was a work that Picasso absolutely knew at the Musée de Luxembourg, where it was part of the Caillebotte bequest in 1894. But Picasso was also interested in Auguste Rodin's work, which he had seen directly for the first time in the fall of 1900 at the Universal Exhibition in Paris, where Rodin had a pavilion of his own, and many works were on display. And this figure of Eve, who is, enclosing her body, pulling her arms around her upper body in a manner that suggests shame. We know, the figure of Eve from the story of the Garden of Eden. And Picasso is very sensitive and interested in how Rodin picks up these psychological feelings and conveys them through pose and gesture. And it is that impact that we see in this bending figure of the bather in the tub in our painting, The Blue Room. And Picasso is very, very noticeably posed her in a dialogue with the poster on the back that is from the Toulouse-Lautrec poster of May Milton. So where the bather is enclosed, a melancholy figure, the poster shows us the Belle Epoque dancer in the cabaret whose feet are flared out and open, whose arms are open, who's dancing on the floor, as opposed to this woman who is enclosing herself. And it is the dawn. You see this rosy light, pale pink on her torso, her pendulant breast captured in between her arms, the room with a bed that suggests that it has been slept in, a bucket on the table at the side with flowers in it, the suggestion of a woman who has had a companion with her perhaps the night before. It is enigmatic, it is elusive, it is a suggestion of a story that is not complete, but it allows us to see this woman as a sympathetic figure. She's not open the way those brothel figures were previously. And the other important part of Picasso's move to the blue period is his experiences at the Saint-Lazare Women's Prison and Hospital. And that also occurs in the fall of 1901. And this shift in the way that Picasso thinks about women from those pictures that we saw that were painted in advance of the Volard exhibition, where women are like for a man's pleasure to look at, whether they are sleeping or just curled up on their bed, or exposing themselves directly to gentlemen in a brothel. Now Picasso has experience at this prison that has an incredible long reputation. The Saint-Lazare prison was one that had existed for several centuries. And during the Reign of Terror in 1793, 1794, it held a number of prisoners whom the government had arrested. And in the 19th century, it became a women's prison. And it became a prison that held both women who were arrested for as criminals, as thieves, as prostitutes, and also a place where women were picked up for street prostitution. And so I just show you here on the right, this is a large view of the entire prison. And so this is the first courtyard where women would be brought into the prison. This is the second courtyard, which you see here on the upper left, that has this well in it where women did their laundry. And you see this back courtyard here in the very back of the building. This is what you see, these kind of arched doorways, that go into this building. This is the apse of the chapel that you see, because it was a sisterhood of nuns that were the authorities who ran the prison and oversaw the women there. And then this hallway of the prison cells that you see in the bottom left. And I bring this illustration on the left in and show you a photograph of this courtyard where the women were brought in. And what I've highlighted in this illustration on the left, which was published in early 1897, it's the arrival of what's called filles publiques. These are like streetwalkers, prostitutes, that were brought into this administrative courtyard for processing. And here in yellow in the center, I'm just highlighting that one of the women who's been picked up has an infant that she's carrying in. This is a doorway here that you see that goes matches the photograph, and this has the judiciary quarter is what it says on this doorway, and that matches this here. And so what you would see is these, the number of women were arrested every night and brought into Saint-Lazare prison. And Picasso is not the first artist who was interested in going to Saint-Lazare. It's still not absolutely clear why he went to Saint-Lazare, although there's some thought that perhaps he was in need of medical treatment for a venereal disease, because Saint-Lazare had a physician who was well known to treat venereal diseases. But other artists who depicted Saint-Lazare are, I show you on the left here, Hubert Robert, 18th century French Rococo painter. He was actually imprisoned in Saint-Lazare during the Reign of Terror. And this painting that you see on the left, distributing milk to the prisoners of Saint-Lazare prison, is a painting he did from memory for a colleague who was in prison with him, so that they could remember this experience. And you see this woman, reaching across the divide here to this balustrade that has these prisoners reaching for these pitchers of milk. And then in the 19th century, 1886, Jean Béraud, a artist contemporary with Gauguin, Monet, but much more realist in his style, did this painting called The Room of Young Women at the Depot. And this gives you some idea. Here's the nun who oversees it, all these different women who have been brought in overnight to be processed. And Toulouse-Lautrec and Théophile Steinlen, who is an illustrator, they both did images of Saint-Lazare women who, see Toulouse-Lautrec's illustration for, sheet music for an Aristide Bruant song here in the center. And then Steinlen's illustration for At Saint-Lazare for the Gil Blas Illustré, the supplement for the daily newspaper. And this is August 9th, 1891. And you see this group of Saint-Lazare women all lined up, and one giving a note to a young woman who's leaving Saint-Lazare. And so Aristide Bruant, who was a cabaret performer and owned cabaret, wrote a song that was well known in the 1880s and 90s, and that's what Toulouse-Lautrec is illustrating here, and it's a, it tells the story of a Parisian prostitute found to have had a venereal disease, being held for treatment at Saint-Lazare, and she's not to be released until she's cured, and she's writing a letter from prison to her pimp. And so these are the précis for Picasso's own experience at Saint-Lazare, but what a difference in the kind of interpretation he gives us of the women that he encountered that made an impression on him, because what we have come to understand, of course, is that Picasso's experience at Saint-Lazare was a transformative one. And there is a psychological intensity to these works. It was a moment when this 19-year-old young man became aware that women carried the burden of sexual activity, that women were the ones who had children, who they had to take care of. Women had venereal disease that they would be incarcerated for. Women engaged in casual prostitution, if you will, in order to help pay the bills. And it was a shock to him to see that there is a part of the prison that allowed pregnant women to have their babies there and to have keep their toddlers until they were, I think, 3 years old. And there was even a section of the prison for maternities for prisoners and convicts who were pregnant. And so this had a tremendous impact on Picasso, and his whole manner of engaging with the subject of women changed with that experience. And it is in the fall of 1901 in Paris that these changes become so dramatically visible in his work. You see here on the screen, Mother and Child by a Fountain, a work at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It is very much one of the numerous maternities that Picasso did that were inspired as works with a quasi-religious overlay to them, suggesting that this woman, prostitute with an infant, is to be associated with the Virgin Mary. And I show you on the left this painting from the Prado Museum in Madrid that Picasso certainly would have known. It's attributed to a 16th century artist named Gerard David. And, everything in a painting by, Gerard David has a symbolic meaning. And so one wonders whether this fountain in Picasso's Mother and Child by a Fountain also has a meaning, and whether he wants us to think of the fountain as a baptismal font. And you can see how his interpretation of this fountain is different than what the actual fountain at Saint-Lazare was in this interior courtyard, where, the courtyard with the bell tower and the clock, and this fountain that you see here in the photograph, and then in this later watercolor by a French artist. And so Picasso is elevating the women of Saint-Lazare, and he's also changing his style, even though you see this very kind of brushy, expressive brushwork. These heavy outlines now are very much a part of his style that he carries over. And here, Woman Ironing, also a work from the Met, 1901. One of the things that was absolutely the case at Saint-Lazare Prison was that labor was something that women were required to do as a form of penance. It was one of the beliefs, the nuns who ran this prison made certain that the women either learn skills that they could take, to the outside world, the everyday world, because many of these women, most of these women were impoverished and certainly at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. And so, and you see in this photograph here on the right, you know, these nuns are overseeing these women in one of these workrooms. In fact, there were 7 workrooms at Saint Lazare where women did these different chores. One of the things that strikes me so remarkably about this painting that Picasso did of the woman ironing here is that the bent pose that she has is so extreme, and he's cropped it there on the left, you know, so that we don't see her entire, the top of her head. She wears, you know, the head covering that is typical of the women of Saint Lazare. And also you see that they all wear these, you know, shawls and other aprons. This is like the uniform. And you can see that she's also dressed like that. She has a head covering, she has uniform. She is like putting her entire weight onto this iron. Both of her hands down to go parallel with one another to show us how the weight of her body, but also perhaps the weight of where she is and how her incarceration is a heavy burden for her, and cropping her into this space. But what I wanted to point out is that, you know, in one sense, we can think of it as an extension of those mourning figures that are in the evocation. But also, I wonder if it doesn't have to do as well with the ceiling of some of these rooms in Saint Lazare and these kind of heavy arched spaces that also seem to kind of bear down upon the individual. And another painting from Paris, Sanzar Woman, is this woman from the Detroit Institute of Arts, the Melancholy Woman. And she is in a cell, and it was, she has the shawl covering around her shoulders. It is night. It is a very stark cell with no comfort. You see an actual photograph of the Saint Lazzar Prison hallways and the doorways that go into these cells. This detention that you see in this photograph on the left, this was a later photograph in the early 19th or early 20th century, but it was one of the larger rooms. But when the women in Saint Lazare violated the rules, solitary confinement cells were something that women were put into, even against their will. There were guards that would drag them there. And it makes you wonder that Picasso, who did have access to Saint Lazare for quite a while, had opportunity to see these spaces that were so hideously avoided or hated by the prisoners. They were, you know, freezing cold in the winter. They were stifling hot in the summer. They had no actual place that was comforting. It was just a plank of wood for a bed. And Picasso has created this very dignified woman sitting there, but she is closed off. In fact, that is the thing that you can say about, you know, also the women ironing, this idea of enclosure, not engaging with us, looking away from us. Her gaze looks, you know, into some distance. She is engaged in her own thoughts. She is not engaged with us. And the sources for Picasso doing this absolutely incredible composition that shows this light on the woman's face and on her shoulders, and then this kind of enveloping blue environment that she's in, and this very extreme geometric space, this interior space that she is tucked into. She's very formal. She doesn't, even though she's holding herself in, she's very still. That is the thing that really is most noticeable in the straightness of her back, the stillness of her figure. And we have to think about what sources Picasso would have drawn on to go and create this kind of extraordinary depiction of a woman that has this kind of sense of sacred figure, like something that one would see in a Gothic church, perhaps, of a or this idea of a praying figure. I bring in Puvis de Chavannes, this painting that Picasso would certainly have known from the Musée de Luxembourg, called The Poor Fisherman. It was a nearly life-size painting, this emaciated figure of the fisherman who also does not look out. He's engaged in his own thoughts, and his arms also are crossed in a prayer pose. Whether that is a source that could be brought to Picasso's manner of transforming this prisoner, this incarcerated woman, and making her into a heroic figure now. And one might also think of Puvis' mural at the Saint-Geneviève, watching over sleeping Paris, that was in the Pantheon in Paris, that he might also have seen at this time. A painting that dates from 1898, just a few years before Picasso's 1901 picture. And it has this geometric framework of the interior and the exterior. And this moonlit night, and the figure of Saint-Geneviève, she is the patron saint of Paris, is turned away from us. And whether Picasso thought, he is molding his new heroine into the kind of framework that these more celebrated paintings provide. And then here, just the last one of the pictures that are from the Paris Saint-Lazare period is this Saint-Lazare figure with the white head covering, the heavy shawl. She's in profile. This infant is held tight to her chest, but she is like bringing together this quasi-religious maternity figure with the idea of the fatal woman. We have here this poster that Picasso certainly would have known, that is the poster for a syphilis cure. And, the woman is holding this flower in her left hand, like Picasso's figure, and behind her back is the black snake. So she is like, luring you in for sexual activity, but beware. And Picasso, the environment now is like this timeless environment of the sea. Connected to Barcelona, of course, a seaport city that Picasso had grown up in. The idea of the boat here in a Puvis painting that he knows, that like the figures of an old man that is close to death in this broken boat, or our poor fisherman in this boat here. And so there is this ghost-like boat in the background, and this very kind of vertical compressed space that's very decorative, the boat seeming to suggest death. And so in Barcelona, when Picasso went back to Barcelona, I'm going to kind of speed up here. When Picasso went to Barcelona in January of 1902, this is a Gothic city that he lived in. It was a city of more than 500,000 people. It was an active seaport. It was an industrial city, but the part of Barcelona where Picasso's world was, where his family lived, where his friends lived, where his studio was, is in the old Gothic part of town. And I just wanted to show you these images here at the Church of the Conception in Barcelona that was taken in the mid-19th century. And then these two photographs on either side by Adolphe Maas that are one of the streets in the Gothic neighborhoods that were taken just a few years later. And you can see these children playing on these narrow Gothic streets. And so Picasso, in the Crouching Beggar Woman from the Art Gallery of Ontario. One of the things that is most extraordinary about the conservation studies that the Art Gallery of Ontario did on this painting is that it revealed that this enclosed figure with her head bowed down was actually conceived initially as a more vignette, a woman that you might have seen on the street. A genre figure is how we would describe her in the art historical context. And this watercolor that you see on the right is a figure that Picasso did in 1902, 1903, of a woman that he, may have encountered on the streets who was begging. And so it appears that when he did this painting soon after he returned to Barcelona, that he started out by thinking of her as a street begging person, someone we might encounter on the streets in passing, in a manner that like those photographs that I showed you. But he changed her. He rejected that manner of depicting her, and he covered up this exposed right hand holding this plate that was discovered in these conservation studies by the Art Gallery of Ontario. And instead, he covered up her arm, and he created this very tightly enclosed figure. The only part of her skin that we see is her face. She is downcast, her eyes are closed, her legs are bent underneath her, and we see her as being very much a more religious figure, a more universal figure, not just a genre figure of someone we would encounter on the street. And this is where Picasso elevates these impoverished women who live at the very bottom of the socioeconomic world. And he elevates them by bringing them into this association with the Virgin Mary and depictions of the Virgin Mary that his Catholic contemporaries, in Catholic conservative Spain would absolutely have understood. And we have brought into this exhibition this particular painting by Luis de Morales, a 16th century Baroque painter called Our Lady of Sorrows. Luis de Morales, an artist who was well known throughout Spain for his sorrowing virgins and his virgins of the Pietà. And you can see this white head covering, absolutely the white scarf that Picasso puts on our figure, the head covering, it's very much evokes this idea of this street woman as a quasi-religious figure that is like the Virgin. And even this figure of the dead woman on the left, where this close-up of her face, that is all in these blues, we have a figure that Picasso painted from memory of a woman that he had seen in the morgue at this hospital of the Holy Cross and St. Paul that is in this neighborhood in Barcelona. We know it today as the El Raval neighborhood that's on the south side of the Ramblas, but the manner in which locals spoke of it in the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, and in most of the 20th century, it was called Chinatown. And that is because that is where the immigrants came, those people who lived on the margins of society. This is the part of town that they lived in. This is where they went to be treated at a hospital. And this young woman, Picasso went there because his friend was a close friend of Barcelona, was an intern working to become a doctor at the hospital. And they went to the morgue, and Picasso was so struck by this young woman who had died. And this Picasso later recalled that he saw a dead woman who had undergone a gynecological operation. Her face made a great impression on me, and when I went home, I painted her from memory. And she absolutely speaks to this idea of this connection between images of the Virgin and these sorrowful women, because this is a painting that Picasso kept, the dead woman. He kept it throughout his entire life. Was not until months before he died that he gave it to the family of this physician that had been his friend at the time, the Riventos family. And he also, still speaking of, looking at these women here, you know, in Barcelona in 1902, this head covering, again, recalling the figures of San Lazzar prostitutes, but now this melancholia, this enclosed figure, contemplation, and art historical precedents, thinking particularly about Rodin's The Thinker, a figure that Picasso absolutely had seen directly in the fall of 1900 in Paris. And we see it again here, repeated. And in Picasso's first sculpture, this very small work of a seated woman who has a very melancholic expression. So Picasso's painting is also being transferred into his first sculptures. And also this idea of prostitutions, and the prostitutes that he was painting in Barcelona, you know, we have this magnificent example in the exhibition of two women at a bar, and it's a monumental size painting. It's a monumental kind of image of these two women from the back, not from the front. They are completely turned away from us. We only know they're in a bar because that glass sits on that thin counter between the two of them. They are, one is on a round stool, one is on a square stool. Their backs are these sculptural entities. Their hair is a sculptural entity, and it is directly taken from the manner in which one can see the back of the figure of the Thinker by Rodin. A photograph of Picasso's studio shows the two women at a bar, upside down on his easel with a postcard of the Rodin on the wall next to it. But it is such a different manner of engaging with this idea of the young women who go to the bars and wait for customers. And this, I show you on the left, a version of just such a subject that Picasso's colleague, one of the modernistas, an older generation of Barcelona artists, had done a decade earlier, Ramon Casas. And you see this young woman sitting in a bar in Paris at the Moulin de la Galette, cabaret, drink in hand, cigar in her right hand, looking around, waiting for someone to come and sit with her and engage with her. And that it's the same in Barcelona, you know, prostitutes were in the bars and the cafes waiting, but Picasso here transforms them into these sculptural entities that are not engaging with us or with each other. They're completely alone. And the idea of charity is another concept that Picasso explores in this moment with women. And I'm just going to move quickly here because I want to get through these last couple of slides. But nursing mothers, the poor, marginalized people, and the charity of soup, these ideas were in Picasso's mind even before he engaged in these blue period pictures that we know so well. They go back to his teenage years, even the idea of charity. But Daumier's work that you see on the left, a drawing called The Soup that Picasso would have known, and Picasso's contemporary Isidre Nonet, this poor people waiting for soup, you know, both speak to this idea of social commentary that Picasso was also engaging with. And Picasso, this painting of the soup is Picasso's real monument to charity, a work he did in 1903. We show you on the left here this drawing that Picasso did in 1902 of a woman, nursing woman, begging on the street, her left hand extended for passersby to give her, money or nourishment. And in the vignette at the upper left, you see that, her figure is repeated again, and it is a man that is offering her some kind of food that it looks like either a bowl or a loaf of bread. And it was Picasso's engagement with the French muralist Pierre Puvis de Chavannes, his work at the Hotel City Hall in Paris and at the Pantheon that really opened Picasso's eyes to how he could create a universal statement about charity with the engagement of the exchange of nourishment between an adult and a child, and the painting of the soup in which this figure of the woman bent over again in this ritualized pose, offering the steaming bowl of soup to this young child, becomes a statement that Picasso labored over for months to find exactly the right manner in which to encapsulate this idea in a universal form. And then this is my last slide, because I want to kind of tie these ends together here. The Belle Epoque on the left, this painting from 1901 called The Diners, and Picasso's print of 1904 called The Frugal Repast that you may all be familiar with. They're like bookends to this idea. In The Frugal Repast, you see this couple, this hollowed out figure of a man that emaciated, turned his head away from us and away from his companion, his eyes deep sockets that suggest he is blind, and this woman who looks out at us, but she looks out at us from the corner of her eye. And, their hands are like four hands kind of wrapped in a kind of circle around the interior of her body. So he is a dark, shadowy, empty cavity on the left, and she is this round figure with asymmetrical breasts, and this manner of which the figure shows this striping here, that abdomen, and these objects, the wine bottle, the bowl, that are embedded in this tablecloth on the table, so different than this 1901 image of the diners. This bourgeois gentleman taking his lady friend out for supper at a private room in a cafe, and this large white tablecloth set with these, kind of fluffy items that kind of live on this white surface. And his companion, she is like a special dessert. He's not looking at her, but it's a very different kind of interaction between a man and a woman in this painting from 1901, as opposed to this much darker, grimmer depiction of a man and a woman in the Frugal Repast. And the Frugal Repast was one of the first works that Fernande Olivier, woman who lived with Picasso from 1905 to 1912, the first woman that Picasso ever had asked to move in with him. And she wrote about this. She said, Picasso, this was the summer of 1904. She wrote about this. He's working on an etching showing an emaciated man and woman seated at a table in a wine shop, who convey an intense feeling of misery and alcoholism with terrifying realism. Such a different manner of engaging with women, their role, from being just these superfluous figures for the engagement and the entertainment of wealthy men to people who are marginalized and barely managing to survive. And so I come to the end of my presentation tonight. If you have questions, I'm happy to try to answer them.
Hey, Sue.
Hey.
And hello, everyone. This is Nehemiah Dixon, Director of Community Engagement at the Phillips Collection. We do have a few questions in the Q&A section, and we have a time to answer a few of them. One attendee asked, did Picasso willingly share the two portraits of his friend Casagamus 60 years later, or was it a discovery after Picasso's death?
It was a discovery in the 1960s. Picasso was working with a young man named Pierre Dex in the early 60s, and he was moving studios and discovering lots of things that he had not looked at for a long time. And so it is with Dex, who wrote, along with a gentleman named Georges Boudin, the first catalogue raisonné of the blue and the rose period, that Picasso shared with this young man, Pierre Dex, that these were pictures of his friend Casagamus that he had done during that summer, just months after Casagamus had died, and that he had never previously shown them to anyone. And that it was Picasso who told Dex that it was thinking about Casagamus's suicide at the age of 20 that got Picasso thinking and moving towards painting in a palette that was monochromatic and blue. And so something that Picasso kept personally from people until many years later, when I think he felt more confident about sharing that personal information.
Thank you. Julia wants to know, or she says, could you talk about the perspective in the blue room? She seems proportionately small. What's up with that?
Isn't she is so insightful. I'm going backwards because there she is. She is small, isn't she? And critics commented on that the very first time this painting was exhibited in April of 1902. They said she seemed out of proportion to the room, and it's absolutely true. She is odd in that sense. You know, she almost seems like she's kind of cut and pasted from something else. And even the manner in which her feet are depicted, you know, is more like something you would find in a sculptor, you know, in a clay model that he's working on, this kind of manner in which the feet are just kind of, you know, the toes are just kind of generically suggested. So yes, very thoughtful and good insight. And the space of this picture is definitely compressed and tipped up. There's all kinds of complicated spatial things going on in this painting that Picasso is assimilating ideas and strategies from Toulouse-Lautrec and Edgar Degas in particular, as he's like kind of summarizing his whole experience about French painting at this particular moment, probably because we now know that it was painted either at the earliest at the end of October or early November. I just point out Picasso's birthday was October 25th, and in 1901 he was just turning 20 years old at this time when he was painting the Blue Room.
Speaking of the blue room, we have three questions that are kind of related. Bonnie wants to know why, Jean wants to know why blue. Bonnie wants to know what inspired him to move away from the blue period. And then We have a question that says, what was the pink period related to?
Well, the shift to a blue palette, happened gradually, but it's a color that was associated with melancholy, a color that was used widely in works in the 19th century to depict loneliness, and that certainly was part of the artistic group that Picasso was spending time with, this awareness of blue as being a very emotional color. But also, I think because it was something that Picasso was emotionally in a reflective mood, and blue was a color that expressed that kind of reflection. So it's both emotional, it's an artistic choice, both. And the shift away from blue doesn't happen automatically, but it happens after he moves to Paris. So, Picasso didn't call the blue period. That was a name given to these works by a French critic, Gustave Coquillot, in 1914, when he was writing a book about artistic styles in the 20th century. And he was trying to find, it was a kind of chronological way of organizing and thinking about Picasso's work. And he gave it the blue period as a title. But this recognition of blue as being a monochromatic palette that Picasso was using extensively during this time was also noted by the critic, by the poet and friend of Picasso's named Gustave Apollinaire, who in 1905, writing a critique about a Picasso exhibition that was mostly about the acrobats and saltimbanques that still had a lot of heavy blue palette involved, that he wrote about Picasso having spent a year working with this blue and humid palette. So it was really only after Picasso moved to Paris in April 1904 and ultimately spent time with a new circle of friends that were poets like Guillaume Apollinaire, André Salmon, Max Jacob, that and he had different activities, and he had actual personal relationships with women, not just casual relationships. But he fell in love with Fernande Olivier, for example, in 1904, when he met her soon after he moved to the Bateau Lavoir after leaving Barcelona. And it took him a year to convince her to to move in with him. And they stayed together till 1912. And so these shifts of palette really happened over 1905 into 1906. And then in 1906, the shift to rose really becomes manifest in the most profound way in the summer of 1906, when Picasso and Fernande Olivier spend the summer in a small Catalan village in the Pyrenees called Gozel, in the Spanish Pyrenees. And that was the first, that was soon after Picasso had sold almost everything out of his studio to the dealer Ambroise Vollard, and for the first time in his adult life, he actually had real money. And his first instinct was to leave Paris for the summer to return to Spain, Barcelona for a period of time, and then the summer away from everything, just in this small village in the Spanish Pyrenees. And that's really when those rose tones become dominant in his palette. And that continues then after he returns to Paris that fall. And if you come to the exhibition, you'll see that we have made that shift manifest in the last room of the exhibition in our main gallery.
Thank you, Sue. I do realize that it's 7:35, everyone, but I do wanted to try to get to at least one more, Sue, if you don't mind.
Sure.
This is another twofer, so I'm sneaking two questions in. Sarah asks, how did Picasso's depiction of women evolve after the Blue period? Michael wants to know if you can say anything about his early, sensitive, caring portrait of women and his later characterization as a womanizer.
Well, his images of women in the Rose period can just remind me again that those images that he painted of Fernand Olivier in Gozel are these kind of monumental images of a woman who is confident in herself. Sometimes it's like she's a goddess. It's not like realist pictures of her. She is, in some paintings, it's like she is like this enormous life-size figure that we recognize who it is simply because of the shape of her eyes. But she's like striding across these kind of empty pink spaces, commanding our attention. Very sensual curves to her body. And another example, this is a work that's owned by the Art Gallery of Ontario that is in the exhibition. She is fully frontal, a word we use, hieratic, she's like an ancient goddess figure standing there from her top of her thighs up, nude, her hands at her pubis in a prayer pose, one hand inside the other, but she is looking down. She's very internalized. Her eyes are, if not fully closed, then she is looking absolutely down. So she is not engaging with us, but she is like this figure that we might see in a major Byzantine mosaic, very much a kind of archaic or Romanesque kind of figure that commands the space. She fills the space. There's nothing that defines where these figures are when he paints them. This is something that's very interesting in the difference between the Saint-Lazare pictures in Paris in 1901 that always seem to have definition of a space of some kind or place. And Picasso starts removing those elements that identify place more and more, so that once you move into works from 1905 and certainly the figures of 1906, you just have these monumental figures of female bodies that command the entire space of these large canvases in a way that monumentalizes them as these incredible female forms that are so different in sensibility from that figure that we see in the Blue Room, the bather. These women are in command of their space. They fill the space of the canvas. And that's really a shift. I think Picasso's pushing himself to kind of explore the female body more directly. clearly his living situation with Fernand Olivier, who's this larger than life, beautiful Amazonian woman, sharing his living space in a way that no other woman ever had. And not that he's creating portraits of her, but her grooming activities, the way she moves, the way she holds herself, just begin to associate in his mind with figures that are more classical, you know, that Picasso knows from his own art historical background, because he was like a sponge. If he saw something, he remembered it. He would synthesize things that from one century to another, from one culture to another. And how we can reconcile the Picasso that seems to be empathetic here at the beginning of his career with the man that became much more misogynistic. You know, I'm not really I'm not a psychiatrist. I can't tell you how these things evolve and happen, but I would just venture to say that when we're looking at these works of the Blue Period, it's always important, I think, to remember that we are looking at the very beginnings of a young man's career, where the Blue Period is his first signature style. It's his first real engagement with the world around him, where he's thinking about where he lives and how he perceives that world around him. And we all change over time. And Picasso, I think it's important for us always to keep in mind that he was born into and grew up in an extremely patriarchal, conservative culture that was Spain at the turn of the century, the end of the 19th century. And so his vision of a woman and what was her role in society was really framed and structured by this very conservative, patriarchal culture that he grew up in. I hope that creates some kind of answer.
Yes, thank you so much, Sue, for tonight. I do want to let everyone know that this program will be available in the next few days on our YouTube channel. Thank you again, Sue, and have a good night.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.